Senator Back.
Deputy President, in rising to speak strongly in support of the Biosecurity Consequential Amendments and Transition Provisions Bill and those associated with it, it's just disappointing to register the contribution by Senator Singh and Senator Cameron before her, two people who have had absolutely and utterly nothing to do with the formulation of the legislation we have before us, and I'm delighted to be able to record that here in the chamber with me are Senators Heffernan, Senator Stirl and Senator Siewert, who with me have been vitally associated with this legislation and its development over time, the transition to where we are today. And I suppose it's the best reflection of when you don't know what you're talking about is to spend 20 minutes ignorantly focusing on one or two very, very small areas that in the overall context of the legislation pale into insignificance. But for Senator Singh's interest, Deputy President, the original Inspector-General position had its origins as the Inspector-General of horse imports as a result of the equine influenza outbreak that we had, which led to the Beale Review and to others. Now, before she goes, I'd just like Senator Singh to know that the Inspector-General, Dr Michael Bond, is a very, very close personal friend. We were at university, both Western Australians, both at Queensland University from the 1960s, and I have maintained a very close association with him over that time. And for that position to be belittled and to be focused on for the length of time it has, Dr Bond and the gentleman before him, and I'm sure Inspector-Generals into the future, will be fiercely independent. And if Senator Singh is in any doubt at all, she need just go back to the questions asked in Senate estimates of the Inspector-General and the role he plays and, in fact, his independence in terms of the questioning. So I didn't even want to speak about partisanship, Deputy President, because this has been such a strongly bipartisan move that gets us to where we are today. And it's disappointing when people would descend to political partisanship, especially in something of the importance of agriculture. But just to reflect, this replaces a bill that came into existence in 1908, some 107 years ago. And the way Senator Singh was going on about Minister Joyce having all these powers, Minister Joyce, almost peculiar to him, does she think that he's also going to still be the minister in 107 years' time? Not even Minister Joyce hopes for that outcome. But let's reflect briefly on what would have been the circumstance in 1908, Deputy President. Exports were of no interest at all. The newly formed states, once the colonies, were desperately trying to feed their populations. The concept of import was almost unknown. We were desperately trying to produce and to sustain those communities as they grew. Also, too, of course, one of the imperatives for federation was to be able to try and normalise trade across what became state borders. And so the concept of a Quarantine Act in 1908, important and all as it was, of course, is totally and utterly different to where we are in 2015. And let us hope, as a result of the excellence of the work that we are doing here and into the future, that this legislation, the 2014-15 bill, will hold good, as indeed the original Quarantine Bill or Act of 1908 will do. But of course it was modified some 50 times, and yes, it was the previous government that introduced the first draft of the Biosecurity Bill that we're discussing. But to minimise and to trivialise and just simply say it's some failure of an Abbott government, we didn't bring the legislation in 5 minutes out, it just simply trivialises the importance of the work that's been done by senators in this place, by departments, by ministerial officers to get to where we are today. And there may be further changes needed. If there are, Deputy President, all well and good. But how important is the agriculture and the agribusiness industries of this nation? Currently generating in excess of $50 billion a year, more than 77% of which are exported. And that's a critically important thing for people to understand. is the fact that we are an exporting nation from our own home state of Western Australia, as Senators Seward and Stirl know only too well. We export more than 95% of our grain. We can't consume it. And so when people say to us, why is it so necessary that we are trading internationally, not only in the Asian region but beyond, it is because we depend on export trade. And as a result of that, we must allow import trade. And so the Biosecurity Bill goes to the issues associated with it. In 2012-13, Deputy President, and contrast this to 1908, there were some 16 million international passenger arrivals, 186 million international mail items, 1.7 million sea cargo consignments, and more than 26 million air cargo consignments. And we know that when the children sitting up there now are adults, those numbers will have increased exponentially. And so therefore, while you are watching this, you need to know that legislation that we're debating here will have an impact on yourselves as young adolescents, through you, Deputy President, and as adults, as you travel overseas, as you study, as you develop your links overseas. Everything that relates to this Biosecurity Bill will be critically important to you. When you come back into Australia and wonder why there is quarantine inspection of what you're doing, remember what is being protected here. We all know the importance of Australia's reputation as a green and safe environmental exporter and producer of foodstuffs. And we also know, and again it would be of interest to those who are watching, that we will be feeding 1.9 billion people more in our region alone by 2050. But, Deputy President, more importantly than that, and the events recently with the hepatitis A only serve to emphasise it, is that that community of people who we have the opportunity to continue providing foodstuffs are wanting even more security of supply, and they are wanting greater safety of supply when we look at the risks. The Chinese, only one example, say that a hungry man is an angry man, and the government of Premier Xi is all about making sure his community do not become angry. So the opportunities that we have are enormous. Deputy President, one of the absolute delights for me of this legislation found its way as a joint submission in January of last year by the Departments of Agriculture and the Department of Health. Why is that so critically important? Simply because we have got to have the world understand the One Health approach, not a health department associated with human health and a Department of Agriculture associated with animals and plants. Deputy President, it's well known internationally that more than 65% of all human infectious and probably parasitic diseases have their origins in animals. And so therefore this legislation, in my view, is groundbreaking because it combines into the Biosecurity Bill those elements that are required in associating ourselves with the risks to human health and indeed those for which agriculture has responsibility. So the concept of us joining human health and agricultural responsibilities into the One Biosecurity Bill to address the risks of pests, diseases that may be coming into this country, and we need only think of the risk of the Ebola virus at the moment. We indeed have the Hendra virus, which has killed a number of my veterinary colleagues. That same virus, born through bats, in this case into horses and onto humans, with a mortality rate in excess of 70%, is exactly the same virus as the Nipah virus, which in Malaysia and in India and in Bangladesh has caused and is causing the death of children and adults as a result of that virus coming through bats, through pigs to humans, and indeed directly from bats to humans. So just one area, Deputy President, of significant importance in this biosecurity bill before us. And I think that's what made me so disappointed when all I could hear from Senators Singh and from Senator Cameron was some mention about an Inspector General, important and all, as that position is occupied by my very close friend Dr. Bond. There is far more to it. Deputy President, can I ask you to reflect for a moment on the figure I just gave you, and that is that agriculture contributes some $50 billion to the Australian economy. It has been estimated by ABARES that if Australia gets foot and mouth disease, and as a veterinarian I would extend that comment to be when Australia gets foot and mouth disease, if it spreads nationally, Deputy President, the estimated figure of the cost to eradicate foot and mouth disease is the same figure, $50,000 million. If one state alone, be it Western Australia, Queensland or the Northern Territory, into which the disease is going to come, the estimate is somewhere between $3.5 and $5.5 billion. And as Senator Siewert and Sterle and Heffernan, I believe, would also know, well, those are just the direct costs. They're not the costs associated with stopping the movement of people across the north. Imagine now in March, at the end of the wet season, we got foot and mouth disease across the north of Australia and we had to put a halt to vehicle movements, in other words, tourism, across the north of Australia. That $50 billion would be short change compared to the overall impact on the economy of the north. And why do I say when rather than if? Just one statistic alone, I'm not suggesting to you that the presence of veterinarians is going to stop foot and mouth disease, but between Geraldton and Cairns, I apologise, between Geraldton and Darwin, we have one Commonwealth veterinary officer, one, for the risk of a disease that would decimate this country's economy. So there are very, very important elements in this bill, very important elements associated with the capacity of this country to be able to deal with an incursion. Of course, because of those figures that I quoted earlier, we've had to move to a risk-based approach. So in other words, we can't guarantee that there will be no incursion of any organisms coming into Australia. But this does beg the question, if I may, Deputy President, because Senators Sterle and Heffernan again were very much involved, when there was a strong request by America, Canada and Japan to allow beef to come into this country. And of course Canada and America did have, or in probably Canada's case still does have, BSE, mad cow, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And of course at the time there was pressure on the then Minister, Mr Burke, by the then Prime Minister, Mr Rudd, and the then Trade Minister, Mr Crean, to allow that beef to come into this country without there being the discipline of an import risk analysis. So Senator Heffernan and Senator Sterle would well remember, and maybe Senator Siewert also, we had a number of inquiries, a number of hearings into that issue. Japan fell out as an applicant because they got foot and mouth disease. The Americans couldn't meet what Australia imposes on itself, and that's a national livestock identification scheme for cattle. And I do recall it was about this time, in fact 2010, we had what turned out to be the last hearing, when I said to the then Chief Veterinary Officer in a hearing, I said, well, Dr Carroll, are you going to tell us about the 7-year-old Angus cow from Manitoba in Canada that's got BSE or MI, and that led, of course, to Minister Burke requiring that there be a full import risk analysis. I make this point, Deputy President, because the processes that are in place in this bill will ensure that there is a full biosecurity import risk analysis. Time doesn't permit me to actually go through in this discussion all of the safeguards that are in place. But contrary to the comments made earlier about what role the Department of Agriculture might have, what role the Minister might have, it is the Parliament. It is the Parliament that has responsibility to the Australian taxpayer, Deputy President, and the reason I use the example of the importation of BSE beef or beef from countries that had it was just simply to make the point and remind the chamber that on that occasion, despite the intense pressure of the then Prime Minister and the then Trade Minister, eventually the then Agriculture Minister made the right decision. But that decision was made as a result of the processes of the Senate. And the processes of the Senate required that there be an inquiry, that there be a number of hearings, and the inadequacy of the original decision process was in fact exposed, and the then Minister made the right decision. And history records, of course, that the Americans and the Canadians and the Japanese on that occasion all withdrew. So it just makes the point that the Parliament must always have the right and the role. Deputy President, there are issues associated with regionality. We have a rich difference regionally in this country. The island state of Tasmania has certain advantages and challenges by virtue of it being insular. Australia indeed has certain benefits as a result of being an island continent. We in Western Australia have again a whole series of different sets of circumstances, and each state and territory would claim those. And I am pleased to see in the legislation that there is acknowledgement of regional differences within the overall capacity to deal. If I have got one concern, it is the question of regulations. Now, the committee, which prides itself on putting policy before politics and has done for some years, made a number of very, very important recommendations, to which the government responded. And for those interested, they should get hold of the responses by the government to the recommendations. But many of them, Deputy President, find themselves to be involved in not the bill, not the Act itself, if proclaimed, but the regulations themselves. In terms of some of the issues that we have discussed here today, for example, the demand to obtain independent scientific expertise, the demand and the right of a wide consultation, the expectation and the opportunity of those who are likely to be adversely affected by decisions to be given further information prior to a final decision being made, and there are others that relate again to the regulations. The point that I want to make, and I would make it whether we were in government or in opposition, is that the Senate committee must have the right to review those draft regulations and to examine them and to challenge them if need be before they are accepted. That is a normal process to happen. There are some definitions, for example, associated with external territories. There's some change of definitions in terms of the 12-mile limit rather than the 200-mile economic exclusion zone. There are issues associated with ballast water. The 1908 Quarantine Bill was silent on ballast water in ships. I don't want to make light of it, Deputy President, except to say how critically important. But what pleases me about this legislation, started by the previous government, for whom I give credit, continued now and hopefully completed by this chamber, is the fact that it can be a living document. It can grow as time is needed, because we are all aware the future of this country lies in our agricultural production, our agricultural exports and indeed our reputation.